Karen screams at kids for selling cookies without a license, then steals a box and runs. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the grocery store parking lot, where the usual hustle and bustle of shoppers moving in and out of the store contrasted sharply with the small, peaceful gathering of young girls sitting at a folding table near the entrance. The Girl Scouts had set up their table, proudly displaying a colorful sign that read, "Girl Scout cookies for sale, Thin Mints, Samoas, Tagalongs, and more." Their neatly stacked boxes of cookies gleamed in the sun, and the girls wore their green sashes adorned with badges, their faces full of excitement as they waited for customers to approach. It was their annual cookie sale, and they were thrilled to be a part of something that not only helped their troop but also gave them a sense of purpose. The girls, ranging from 8 to 12 years old, sat together with their troop leader, Miss Carter, who was watching over them with a warm smile. She encouraged the girls to take turns standing up to offer cookies to passing shoppers, teaching them how to speak confidently and politely, but there was a nervous energy in the air, too. It was their first time doing a sale like this outside the local park, and the grocery store parking lot offered the perfect spot to catch people as they finished their shopping. They hoped to reach a wide range of customers and make enough sales to reach their fundraising goal for the troop's next camping trip. Among the group was Ellie, a 10-year-old with bright eyes and an enthusiastic grin. This was her first year in Girl Scouts, and she had been practicing her pitch for days. She was excited to tell people about the cookies and hoped to make her first real sale. She adjusted the tie of her sash, feeling the weight of the cookies that lay on the table, ready for a potential customer to approach. But the excitement quickly turned to confusion and then to fear when a voice, sharp and abrupt, cut through the air, startling the girls. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was loud, unmissable, and carried across the parking lot, immediately drawing the attention of several people passing by. The girls turned to see a woman, standing at the edge of the parking lot near the sidewalk. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was contorted into a mixture of disbelief and irritation. She was glaring at them, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ellie's smile faltered slightly as the woman approached, her tone escalating with each word. "You can't just sell things like this without a permit. Do you have a license? Do you have the proper paperwork?" The woman's voice was sharp, almost accusatory, as though the girls were committing some serious offense. Ellie and her troop leader exchanged confused glances. Miss Carter, usually calm and collected, stood up from her chair and walked toward the woman, her face registering a mix of concern and frustration. "Ma'am, these girls are participating in a fundraiser for their Girl Scout troop," she explained gently. "They're selling cookies, and it's all part of a program they're involved in. They're not breaking any laws." The woman, who would later come to be known as Karen, was having none of it. "That's illegal," she shouted, her voice rising now, attracting even more attention from people leaving the store and getting into their cars. "You need a license to sell things like this. What are you teaching these kids? That it's okay to break the law?" Ellie's heart began to race, the overwhelming feeling of being scolded by a stranger clouding her ability to think clearly. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? They were just trying to sell cookies to help their troop, to raise money for their camping trip. She felt her eyes sting, and she quickly blinked to fight back tears. Miss Carter, trying to maintain her composure, took a step closer to Karen, her voice firm but respectful. "I assure you, ma'am, these sales are fully permitted. Girl Scouts across the country do this every year, and we follow all local regulations. We're not doing anything illegal, and I would appreciate it if you would speak to us respectfully." But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, her frustration seemed to grow with every word, her voice becoming even louder and more aggressive. "Respectfully? Respectfully? You're teaching these kids that it's okay to break the law, and I won't stand for it." She was practically yelling now, her face flushed with anger. "If you don't get rid of this stand, I'll make sure you're all reported. I'm going to call the police." Ellie was frozen, unsure of what to do. She had never been involved in anything like this before, and the sheer intensity of Karen's anger was intimidating. She glanced at the other girls, who were all looking at the scene with wide eyes. They were clearly scared, and it wasn't hard to understand why. Karen's voice, loud and harsh, filled the air, drawing the attention of more and more people. Ellie noticed a few people in the parking lot staring, but no one seemed willing to intervene. She looked toward Miss Carter, who was now speaking more urgently to Karen, trying to calm her down, but Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild, and she was only becoming more animated. Then, without warning, Karen's anger seemed to reach its boiling point. She reached for a box of Thin Mints, her fingers gripping the cardboard box with a force that made it crinkle in her hand. "You think I'm going to stand here and watch you break the law?" she screamed, startling the girls and making them jump back. With one swift motion, Karen grabbed the box of cookies and dashed toward her car, moving so quickly that no one had time to stop her. Miss Carter shouted after her, but it was no use. Karen had already reached her car and slammed the door shut, the engine roaring to life as she sped out of the parking lot. In the chaos, Ellie stood still, feeling the shock settle over her like a heavy blanket. The last thing she had expected was for someone to actually steal the cookies, to make off with them as if they were nothing more than an object of anger. The whole situation felt surreal, as though it were happening to someone else. The other girls were silent, unsure of how to react. Their eyes were wide, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. Miss Carter, her hand still raised as though trying to stop Karen, looked around at the girls, her expression one of disbelief. "Did she really just take the cookies?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Nodding slowly, Ellie finally spoke, her voice shaky. I think she did. She just grabbed the box and ran." Miss Carter took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Okay, girls, stay calm. We're going to be fine. Let me handle this." She quickly pulled out her phone, dialing the number for the store's security. Within moments, she was speaking to someone on the other end of the line, explaining the situation. The store's security team took the details and promised to handle it. As Miss Carter hung up the phone, she turned to the girls and gave them a reassuring smile. "They'll be looking into it. They'll check the parking lot footage, and we'll figure this out." Ellie still couldn't believe what had just happened. How had Karen gone from yelling at them to outright stealing the cookies? The injustice of it all stung, and it wasn't just the stolen Thin Mints, it was the feeling of being treated as though they were doing something wrong when all they wanted was to sell cookies and help their troop. A few hours later, after the girls had packed up their table and returned to their troop meeting, the phone rang again. It was the store security. "We've found her," the voice on the other end said. "We were able to get her license plate number from the security footage. The police are involved, and she's been contacted. We'll handle the rest, and we're pressing charges for theft." Ellie's heart lifted a little at the news. It wasn't about the cookies anymore, it was about the fact that someone had stood up for them, that the injustice had been acknowledged. The fact that the police had gotten involved gave Ellie a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As the girls gathered together to share the news, they found comfort in knowing that the right thing had been done, even if it took a little while for the world to catch up. Ellie, her eyes wide with relief, smiled. She had never expected this kind of adventure during a simple cookie sale, but in the end, she had learned something important. No one could take away her voice, her worth, or her right to stand up for herself. And that was something even the most entitled person couldn't steal. The moment Karen slammed the door of her car and sped out of the parking lot, leaving the table of girls behind in stunned silence, a heavy weight settled over the group. The suddenness of her departure, combined with the absurdity of her theft, made everything feel unreal. The girls, who had been so eager to sell their cookies and make their goal for the troop, now stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't just about the cookies, it was about the way they had been treated, the way someone had come in, yelled at them, and then taken something that didn't belong to her, all without any remorse. The entire interaction had been a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief, and no one could quite grasp what had just happened. Miss Carter, who had tried to remain calm throughout the entire ordeal, now stood at the table, her hand still clutching her phone as she looked out into the parking lot, trying to make sense of the situation. Her eyes searched for Karen's car, but by now, it had disappeared, blending into the busy flow of traffic. She slowly lowered the phone, realizing that this wasn't just an unfortunate misunderstanding, it was something that needed to be addressed, something that needed action. Her first instinct had been to try and defuse the situation, to explain things and make sure the girls didn't feel as though they had done something wrong. But now, with Karen gone and the cookies stolen, it was clear that this situation had escalated beyond what anyone had expected. "Girls," Ms. Carter said quietly, her voice steady but filled with the frustration she was trying to suppress. "I know this is upsetting. We all expected today to be about selling cookies, meeting new people, and having fun. But this is something different. We're going to get through this together, and I'm going to make sure we handle this the right way." Ellie, who had been standing off to the side, trying to make sense of the chaos, felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at her friends, who were still processing the events. Some of them were on the verge of tears, others were just staring off into space, as if trying to make sense of the way their afternoon had unraveled. The excitement they had felt earlier that day, when they set up the table and displayed their cookies, had quickly evaporated in the face of such a shocking event. Ellie could still feel the sting of Karen's anger, the sharpness in her words, and the way she had thrown the bowl of soup at Nadia earlier in the day. That same anger had now been directed at them, in the form of stolen cookies, and she wasn't sure how to process that. "I don't understand," one of the girls said, her voice small and uncertain. "Why did she take the cookies? We didn't do anything wrong." Miss Carter sighed, looking around at the girls and giving them each a reassuring glance. "We didn't do anything wrong, and that's the key. Sometimes, people act out of frustration or anger, and they make decisions that aren't based on logic. Karen clearly misunderstood what we were doing, and instead of trying to understand, she let her emotions get the best of her. But this isn't on us. We're going to make sure she's held accountable for her actions." Ellie bit her lip as she watched Miss Carter, feeling a small sense of relief at her words. She knew the situation wasn't over, and the anger that still simmered inside her hadn't gone away. But there was something comforting in knowing that Miss Carter was taking charge, that she wasn't just going to let this woman get away with what she had done. Ellie knew that what had happened was unfair, but it was also a lesson, one that she hadn't expected to learn today. People could be cruel, and sometimes that cruelty came from a place of ignorance, a place where empathy and understanding were cast aside in favor of a quick judgment. "We're going to call security," Miss Carter continued, her tone firm. "We'll report the theft, and we'll get the information we need to track her down. I know it might seem scary, but this is important. We're not going to let someone walk away with what isn't theirs." The girls nodded, still processing, but slowly starting to gather their thoughts. They watched as Miss Carter made the call, speaking calmly and with authority, detailing the situation to the store security. She explained the theft, the details of Karen's behavior, and how the woman had stolen the cookies and fled the scene. Ellie, though still stunned, felt a strange sense of pride in her troop leader. Miss Carter wasn't backing down. She was making sure that they stood up for what was right, that they didn't let someone's bad behavior define their experience. After a few minutes, Miss Carter hung up the phone and turned back to the girls. "Security is going to review the footage from the parking lot cameras," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "They'll have a lead on her, and they'll be contacting the authorities. In the meantime, we're going to keep calm and keep going. We still have cookies to sell, and that's not going to change just because one person was rude." Ellie felt a surge of gratitude for Miss Carter's calm demeanor. She could see the weight of the situation on her face, the way she was trying to balance concern for the girls with a sense of responsibility to make sure everything was handled properly. Ellie knew that it wasn't easy, but she admired the way Miss Carter was handling things with such poise. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Ellie and the other girls continued to sell cookies, though the earlier excitement had been replaced by a quiet determination. They weren't going to let Karen's actions ruin their day, and though the memory of the theft still stung, they found a sense of unity in the way they worked together to keep things moving forward. They smiled at customers who passed by, handed out their order forms, and even managed to make a few more sales. It wasn't the ideal ending to what had started as a perfect afternoon, but they were doing the best they could, and that was enough. By the time the sun began to set, the group had packed up their table and gathered their things. They didn't make their original sales goal, but they had still managed to sell a good number of boxes, and they were proud of what they had accomplished despite the disruption. Miss Carter promised them that the police would follow up on the situation and that, in the end, Karen would be held accountable for what she had done. It wasn't about the cookies anymore, it was about standing up for what was right and making sure that no one got away with treating others that way. The girls loaded their boxes into the car and began to head home, the lessons of the day settling into their minds. As Ellie sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window, she realized that the experience had taught her something valuable. It wasn't just about the cookies or the sale, it was about learning to face challenges with courage and grace, about standing up for herself and others, even when it seemed like the odds were against her. Karen might have stolen their cookies, but she hadn't stolen their dignity, and that, Ellie knew, was something that would stay with her far longer than any box of Thin Mints ever could. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, but the events of the afternoon in the grocery store parking lot continued to linger in Ellie's mind, and every time she thought about the incident, the knot in her stomach seemed to tighten just a little more. It wasn't that she was angry, at least, not entirely, but there was something deeply unsettling about what had happened, something that hadn't quite settled in her mind. The way Karen had appeared out of nowhere, her anger and judgment seeming so out of place in a community of people who had nothing but good intentions, had been like a jarring note in an otherwise peaceful melody. Ellie had seen people angry before, even rude customers, but the way Karen had escalated the situation, grabbing the cookies, hurling accusations, and then running off with the box of Thin Mints, felt like something more, something deeper than simple impatience or frustration. It felt personal. The more Ellie thought about it, the more she wondered whether Karen had acted the way she did because of who they were, or perhaps because of what she assumed them to be. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had seen them, the group of young girls, with their badges and sashes, and made a judgment based solely on what she assumed they were capable of or entitled to. And that, more than the theft itself, had felt like the real offense. The week following the incident was filled with phone calls and emails as Ms. Carter worked closely with store management and the local authorities to track down Karen. The security footage had indeed shown her stealing the box of cookies and fleeing to her car, but the investigation, though it seemed like it would be straightforward, had taken longer than expected. Karen had been difficult to locate, and as more time passed, Ellie started to wonder whether they would ever get the cookies back or whether Karen would simply get away with it. It wasn't about the cookies, though, it was about the principle of the matter. They had been treated like criminals for no reason other than someone's baseless assumption that they were doing something wrong, and that was the part that felt most unjust. Ellie couldn't shake the image of Karen running off with the cookies, her smug expression still etched into Ellie's memory, like a stark reminder that not everyone played by the same rules. As the days wore on, Ellie and her friends returned to their normal routines, attending school and meeting for their Girl Scout troop activities, but it was hard to ignore the impact of the event. Every time someone mentioned the cookie sales, there was a brief silence, a hesitation, as if no one was quite sure how to bring up the incident again. It had been such an unexpected disruption, something no one had anticipated, and though the girls had tried to move on, they all knew it had affected them more deeply than they cared to admit. Miss Carter, in her usual calm and collected manner, kept everyone reassured, reminding them that they had done everything right and that Karen's actions would not define them. Remember, she would say, the best way to handle these situations is with grace and dignity. We're not here to fight or argue. We're here to serve, to help, and to have fun. Don't let one bad experience sour the whole thing. Despite her attempts to stay positive, Ellie couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment when it came to the way things had unfolded. She had joined the Girl Scouts to learn, to give back to her community, and to be a part of something bigger than herself, but that one incident had made her question how far kindness and goodwill could truly go. Could they really make a difference in the world if there were always people like Karen, ready to tear down everything they stood for with a single act of disrespect? Then, one afternoon, just as the girls were beginning to put the whole situation behind them, a call came through from Miss Carter that made Ellie's heart skip a beat. The police had located Karen, and she had been brought in for questioning. The process had taken longer than anticipated because Karen had tried to evade responsibility, but in the end, they had tracked her down through the information on her vehicle's license plate, and now, the matter was finally coming to a head. Ellie felt a surge of emotions, relief, anger, and a quiet sense of vindication, as she listened to Ms. Carter explain that Karen had been confronted with the evidence and was being asked to return the stolen cookies. The authorities were handling the situation, and it seemed that justice, though delayed, was on its way. "I'm glad they found her," Ellie said softly to her mother later that evening, as she sat on the couch and absently flipped through the pages of a book. Her mind, however, was far from the pages in front of her. She had been trying to distract herself, but she kept thinking about what had happened and the fact that Karen was finally going to face the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just about the cookies, it was about standing up for what was right, about showing that no one could just walk all over them without repercussions. Her mother, who had been quietly listening, set down her cup of tea and turned toward her. "I know, honey," she said, her voice warm with understanding. "But remember, sometimes the hardest part isn't the outcome, it's the journey. You've handled yourself so well throughout all of this, and I'm proud of you." Ellie smiled at her mother's words, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in days, the anger and frustration that had built up inside her seemed to ease just a little. She had been so focused on the injustice of the situation that she hadn't stopped to appreciate how far she had come in dealing with it. She had learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself, about not allowing others to define her worth, and about the importance of community. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fair, but it had been a powerful reminder that standing up for what was right wasn't always about the outcome, it was about how you handled yourself in the face of adversity. The next day, Ellie received another call from Ms. Carter. Karen had been charged with theft, and she had been ordered to return the cookies to the troop, along with a formal apology for her behavior. The stolen cookies were on their way back to the bistro, and the authorities had made it clear that they would be keeping an eye on Karen moving forward. It was a relief, of course, but there was also a sense of closure in knowing that the matter had been taken seriously and handled properly. Ellie knew that the situation had been complicated and stressful, but in the end, they had come out stronger. They had stood their ground, and they had learned that sometimes the right thing wasn't always the easiest thing to do. The day after that, the cookies were delivered, neatly packaged, and ready for sale. Miss Carter called a small meeting with the troop, thanking them for their patience and resilience in the face of the ordeal. She praised their dedication to the cause, their commitment to their mission, and the way they had all worked together to move forward. The girls, for the first time since the incident, shared a collective sense of pride in the way they had handled the situation. The cookies were back, and they were ready to sell them once more, not out of obligation, but because they truly believed in the cause, in the strength of their community, and in the power of standing up for what was right. Ellie left the meeting that day feeling a little lighter, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the cookies anymore. It was about what they represented, the lessons learned, the unity of the troop, and the sense of dignity that could never be taken away. As she walked back to her car with her friends, she realized that the incident with Karen had been more than a lesson in patience and perseverance, it had been a lesson in resilience. And that was something that would stay with her long after the cookies had been sold. The days that followed the resolution of the cookie theft were filled with a mix of relief and reflection for Ellie and the rest of the troop. The sense of victory over the injustice that had occurred was undeniable, but it was the lessons learned that truly left a mark on them all. The girls had come together in a way that showed their strength, their unity, and their ability to rise above adversity. Despite the tumultuous events, they had managed to keep their spirits high, continuing their mission to sell cookies and raise funds for their troop. There was a new sense of purpose among them, as though the experience had solidified their bond and strengthened their resolve. Ellie couldn't help but feel proud of how they had handled everything. They had remained calm in the face of hostility, they had stood up for themselves when others had tried to undermine them, and they had come out the other side not only victorious but more united than ever. But for Ellie, the lessons went deeper than just standing up for herself. It wasn't just about the cookies, it was about learning how to face challenges with grace, how to maintain dignity in the face of unfairness, and how to stand tall even when someone tried to knock you down. Karen's actions, though deeply frustrating and unfair, had shown Ellie something crucial, that sometimes the world wasn't as simple as good versus bad, right versus wrong, but that in those moments of grayness, what truly mattered was how you responded. Ellie had learned that sometimes it wasn't enough to just stand up for yourself, you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it wasn't easy to do. The day after the cookie delivery, Miss Carter made an announcement to the troop during their regular meeting. She spoke with quiet pride, acknowledging the hard work and resilience that had gotten them through the past week. There were still a few lingering worries about the confrontation with Karen, but the overall mood was one of determination. Miss Carter expressed how impressed she was with how the girls had stuck together and supported each other through such a challenging situation. For Ellie, it was a moment of validation, a reminder that the troop was not just about selling cookies, but about the sense of community and support that came with it. They weren't just selling boxes of Thin Mints or Samoas, they were learning valuable life lessons about friendship, teamwork, and standing firm in the face of adversity. Each of you handled this situation with so much grace, Miss Carter continued, smiling warmly at the group. I know it wasn't easy, but you all rose above it. Remember, these cookies are about more than just the sales. They represent what you're learning in Girl Scouts: responsibility, resilience, and the power of community. I couldn't be more proud of all of you. Ellie felt a swell of pride in her chest as Miss Carter's words sank in. The experience, which had started as an upsetting and traumatic event, had ultimately become a turning point for her. She had learned how to advocate for herself and others, how to face conflict with composure, and how to rely on the support of those around her. The cookies, the sales, the fundraiser, they were all important. But what Ellie would carry with her for years to come was the strength and resilience that she had discovered within herself and the bond she had formed with her troop. In the weeks that followed, things slowly returned to normal. The girls continued with their cookie sales, now with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper connection to the mission. They were no longer just selling cookies, they were selling the values they believed in: resilience, teamwork, kindness, and standing up for what was right. Karen's theft, while still a source of frustration, had ultimately brought the troop closer together. They had weathered the storm, and they had emerged stronger than they had been before. Ellie's confidence grew with each sale they made, each conversation they had with customers, each time they worked together as a team to meet their goal. It was no longer just about the individual sales or the boxes of cookies being handed over, it was about the experiences they were sharing, the lessons they were learning, and the pride they were all taking in their collective success. Ellie found herself taking on more leadership roles within the troop, offering encouragement to her fellow Girl Scouts and sharing the lessons she had learned during the difficult days. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the back, she was a part of the heart of the group, and her newfound strength shone through in everything she did. The final moments of their cookie sale season were marked by a small but significant celebration. The girls had reached their fundraising goal, and Miss Carter arranged a special gathering to celebrate their success. They had raised enough money to fund a camping trip, and the excitement of the upcoming adventure filled the air. The girls sat together, enjoying cookies and stories, laughing about their favorite moments of the sale season. There were no longer any lingering fears or doubts. The troop had made it through the challenges, and they had come out the other side victorious. As the day wound down and the girls began to pack up their things, Ellie found herself standing quietly, looking out at the parking lot where the whole ordeal had begun. The parking lot seemed so ordinary now, a place that was full of memories, both the good and the difficult ones. It was hard to believe that the event that had seemed so large and overwhelming at the time had now been reduced to a series of lessons learned and experiences shared. Ellie thought about how much she had changed since the first day she had walked into Girl Scouts, how she had started this journey as someone unsure of herself and now stood here, stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever to continue growing and learning. As the last of the girls gathered their belongings and headed toward the parking lot, Miss Carter walked over to Ellie, giving her a knowing smile. "You did great today," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You've come a long way, Ellie." Ellie smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. She had come a long way, and she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. She had learned that challenges were a part of life, but how she responded to them was what truly defined her. In that moment, as she stood among her friends, she realized that the lessons she had learned in Girl Scouts would stay with her for the rest of her life. They were more than just cookie sales or badges on a sash. They were the values she would carry with her as she grew older, the strength she would rely on in times of hardship, and the friendships she would treasure forever. With one final glance at the parking lot, Ellie turned and joined the others, ready to continue her journey with the Girl Scouts, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would be ready to face them with resilience, confidence, and the unwavering support of the friends who had become her second family. The lessons of the cookie sale, of Karen's theft, and of the way they had all come together would remain with her forever, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was strength in unity, and there was always something to be learned.